And just like that, I am live. This is the first time that I've ever gone live. So this is definitely something I'm experimenting with and trying to see. But I wanted to go live, just kind of talk around my podcasting journey, to talk a little bit more around like how, podcasting can actually be something that's extremely valuable for people that are thinking or trying to grow their business, especially if you're trying to do it in kind of like a little bit more of an organic way. If you don't know, I'm Gresh, and I've done and created a slew of different types of content like over the years. Podcast for ultimately maybe the last, I want to say, 9, 10, maybe 11 years or so have been doing podcasting. So I've had a weekly podcast that was a little bit more sporadic. It literally just started out just as me recording or taking some recordings when I was interviewing people, and created an intro and outro and added that in and created a podcast out of that. So that was the CEO Chat podcast. That was the first podcast that I did probably around 10 or 11 years ago. But I did that, got that up to doing it weekly. Had a not fully focused kind of streamlined way that I did that podcast. And then I moved over into what is now the IAMCEO podcast, which is a daily podcast, which I've done for about 9 years, 9 or 10 years. It's been a daily podcast. It wasn't in the beginning, but it's definitely been daily for the last couple years. So I've done over 1,600 episodes, interviewed loads of amazing people. I always say like the former CEO of Calvin Klein on up to a 10-year-old who was just starting their business. So I think it's a fantastic medium to really get your name and information out there. But I think one of the really big aspects that people don't really understand, I think, is that it's all around storytelling, but it's of course creating that piece of content and co-creating that piece of content. But I think it goes to another level when you're able to develop a relationship from that content. So I actually had somebody on my show, James Carberry. We did something. He has something, and he has a book called Content Based Networking. And I think that's one of the best aspects around podcasting that people don't really think about. It's not just the piece of content. Don't get me wrong. You really get that opportunity to kind of co-create, which I think is something that is phenomenal and one of my like core pillars inherently in who I am and what I do. But I think the networking, the opportunity that can kind of come from there is sometimes the most underutilized parts of creating this. So I'm running a little bit behind, but I really want to give you a little bit more of a basis of like why I wanted to talk around podcasting and why I think it's so phenomenal. And I'm really big into creating what I call building your own media company. You are a media company. I feel like we all are that in some form, shape, or fashion. I really draw a parallel between you being a media company is very similar to you trying to cook your favorite dish. Your marketing strategy, what you're trying to do, is very similar to that. You go to the grocery store and you figure out what ingredients are going to be integral or going to be key to you creating your dish. I always go to my mom's sweet potato pie and or pineapple cake. It's probably some of my favorite things that she makes. With that, it's like you want to make sure that you're getting the things that you need for what you're trying to create. A lot of times as business owners, as entrepreneurs, we get very much so that shiny object syndrome. We get that squirrel, like, oh, squirrel, oh, let me move to that, move to that. When in reality, we need to be very focused on what we're trying to create. And don't get me wrong, there's always room for experimentation and things like that. But I think we have to be very, 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 very locked in on what our goals are. So when I talk about building a media company, I usually say you want to make sure that you're clear on your resources that you have available to you, whether it's time and or money. You want to be very clear around what your goals are, and you want to know who you're targeting. And the reason that I say that podcasting sometimes ends up being like a really great way to build your media company, and one of those key ingredients, is because a lot of times you can either use that piece of content where your actual audience is maybe listening to um, that actual podcast, or you want to create that piece of content. But the thing that I'll talk around a little bit is you can take podcasting, you can take that interview, and you can repurpose it into more content, which I think is one of the most powerful things to do overall. So really, understand and make sure that you understand those three questions, but really look at podcasting as one of the ingredients in your overall marketing strategy that can help you get to where you want to be. And very much so, like going to the grocery store, you pick the ingredients that are going to be integral to what you're trying to do. So there's so many different things out there. There's podcasting, there's going live, there's I even have this broad definition of media where I say it's simply the transference of content and information from one person to another. So if you really think about it, from that definition, you can literally look at media as like having a one-to-one conversation with somebody. So I even consider, face-to-face networking a form of media, handing out your business cards, handing out flyers. Of course, traditional things like your TikToks, or maybe not as traditional, but your new age media things like your TikToks, your Facebook pages, Facebook groups. And I think one of the really cool things, for better or worse, and where the opportunity lies, is that people take in content and information in a much more fragmented way than they ever had. Way back in the day, I used to work for Yellow Book, and they changed their name to Haibu as I was literally going through training. But one of the things that they mentioned is that some of the old salespeople said that when they worked with Yellow Book, you literally would get and pay your money for a Yellow Book ad. It'd be on the front page. And if anybody needed a plumber, they would go there, they would call that. You would literally be able to put your kids through college, be able to start a 401k, do all these things just from the Yellow Book ad, because there was one way that people took in information. That has changed, obviously. So what I really want to kind of hammer home is that while, of course, you're going to be having this conversation with the guest, with the host, you're going to learn a little bit more about you, what you do. What you really want to think is like, how can you leverage that content in order to repurpose it so that it can, build, more and more opportunity for your authority. So that's one of the things that, you really want to kind of look at whenever you're thinking about, being on a podcast. You want to look at audience size. You want to get an idea of, as far as like engagement, like how are people interacting, how are they getting their information out there, and how much do you even trust that information. But don't get me wrong, like, even if you're on a podcast that literally only one person is listening to, and that might be the host, you want to make sure that you get that content so that you can repurpose it, so that you can share it to your content. But as much as I am really gung ho on building your own media company, I always say the next best thing is jumping on somebody else's media company. So, who do you know that has a podcast? I'm talking about podcasting, but there's blogging, there's vlogging, there's so many different ways that people will take in content. But who can you tap into that is where your audience is? Remember, one of those core questions that you want to ask is, who are you targeting? So once you know who you're targeting, find out how they're taking in content. Are they listening to podcasts? Are they maybe reading more? So maybe you take that podcast, you transcribe it, and you create it into a blog post. Just really think about like how you can really leverage this opportunity to not just spend that hour long, that hour period of time, or sometimes there's podcasts that are 2 or 3 hours, the Joe Rogan style, that are a lot more conversational. But think about how you can take that piece of content and repurpose it in many different ways. And that's something that I've been able to kind of do, just being and guesting on a lot of podcasts, is being able to kind of take those pieces of content and try to repurpose it in different ways. I've even had it as pieces of content that I've had on my show as well too. So really think about that. Make sure you go through that check mark to understand like what might be a really great way for you to spend your time and leverage that resource as much as possible. So building authority and credibility is probably going to be one of the biggest things that you can do for podcasting. I think you get instant credibility by having a platform for people to be able to kind of share on. So when you are invited on a podcast, even if you have to apply, know that it's going to give you more credibility. If you say, I was just featured on this podcast, or I was just featured on that podcast, or in that blog post, that gives you instant credibility, because what it means is that you are somebody that is an expert, or at least somebody that has enough notoriety that people want to talk to you. So understand it's one of the best ways that you can build, authority and credibility without having to like write a book or things like that. But don't get me wrong, obviously people that write books usually go on podcasting tours, but know that it adds on to that credibility because it gives you that opportunity to say that you're known for this specific thing. And like I mentioned, knowing who you're targeting is going to be one of the biggest things that you want to do. So it's going to give you that opportunity to reach and engaged audiences. So if you really do your homework and due diligence, you're going to be able to understand exactly what are the audiences that are listening to that specific podcast. So you might not go on a sports podcast if you're trying to sell a SaaS product, but you might also go on a sports podcast if you are trying to find a sales product, or sell a SaaS product, because you really want to drill down and know your ideal client more than everybody else. You might realize that a lot of the people that are the entrepreneurs, the business owners, or the people that might use your SaaS product, they might watch ESPN every morning or every afternoon, or pay attention to the sports, because they're very competitive. So that's why it's so important to not only know like where you're spending time, but know also where your audience is spending their time, so you can ultimately be there. And keep in mind too that everybody, when I was in BNI chapter, one of the things that the founder always said is that everybody's listening to the same station, WIIFM. What's in it for me? And all that means is that everybody's trying to basically, you want to hear what somebody is looking for, but you also have to understand that they're looking for what they're looking for, what's in value to them. So when you're thinking about podcast hosts, make sure that you are understanding like what's in it for them. And if you are pitching to a sports podcast, even though you have a SaaS product, maybe you're going to spend more time talking around something related to that SaaS product that could help benefit them. So understand that you're always trying to bring it back to the host, because as much as the host is looking for content and information, they're also looking to try to bring value to their audience. And as a host, that's one of the big things that you always try to do, is create something that's valuable right then and right there when we're having that conversation, but something that can be valuable ever in the future. And that's where, number three, creating and getting evergreen content is going to be one of the really big things. So I mentioned repurposing, and I used to have on my wall this kind of like white paper that literally had all the different things that people could do to repurpose content. So you can literally take a piece of content, which could be a video. You take that video, you strip out the audio, it becomes a podcast. You take that podcast, you transcribe it, it becomes a blog post. You take that blog post and you chop it up, it becomes a LinkedIn post, and you can share it on Facebook, you can share it on X, Twitter. And then you take that video and you splice it up into shorts. It could go on YouTube, and then it could also go on TikTok, and you can do all these different things with your pieces of content. You take all those pieces of content and you chop them up into the nuggets, the really great information, and that can end up being a part of a white paper. So you can take this piece of content that you're doing, that you're sharing your story, and leverage it to do and be recreated in so many different ways. And repurpose is the word that everyone uses, but I think one of the really big opportunities that you have for leveraging podcasting is that people don't always realize that you are getting the opportunity to be put on a pedestal. The guest is really the person that I, as a host, want to shine light on. I want to know as much as I can about your story, your background, the tools of the trade, the things that you've learned, all those things to help out our audience. But you are the person that has the spotlight on you when you're doing that interview. So any host is going to want to make sure that they do lift you up as much as possible. I always say, like, especially when I have people on the show, is that I usually read their bio to introduce them. And I think sometimes when I get people that apply or they fill out their form, sometimes they only put a sentence or so in that bio. And while you can do that, it leaves more time for us to have a conversation. I think what it does is it takes away from that opportunity to kind of build you up to be able to talk around those things. So don't skip that part where you start to introduce yourself and talk about all the things that you do, because it's not you, beating your chest and saying, hey, I'm great because of X, Y, and Z. You're going to get the host to do that for you. They're going to be able to share exactly what you do and how you do it and why you do it and what makes you special. And frankly, I've been on podcasts where sometimes I haven't even seen something be of value that a host has seen as that has saw it to be of value, that wants to share it to their audience. So I think that's another like really big thing that we want to try to make sure that we do, is we understand that again, this is a way for you to build up your authority, build up your credibility, to build up your story and what you've been able to do to be able to provide more value to your audience. And your audience is going to see you as the go-to person because you're on this podcast, because this person is interviewing you, because of all these reasons, the things that you mentioned. So make sure that you're leveraging it to do that. And you're not necessarily doing a podcast to get all the time. You're doing it as a way to create value. If you're able to create value, be seen as a valuable person, then it's something that people are going to see and know you for. So whether you're a coach or consultant, or you're a plumber, or you're a tradesperson, or you have an HVAC company, whatever it might be, again, this is a way for you to be able to build your credibility so you're seen as a go-to person. And I think one of the things that I myself, when I first started my business, I started a digital marketing business. We did web design, supported SEO services. One of the things that kind of shocked me more than anything else is that everybody didn't know everything that I knew. We sometimes don't give ourselves enough credit for the work that we put in, the credibility, just the interest that we have and the passions that we've kind of invested in. And I think a lot of times when you start to have conversations with people, and people are like, "Wait a minute, you know how to do that?" Which is kind of the way that I started my business. You start to open up more doors to these opportunities and what that can ultimately look like. So I think that's one of the really big things that people don't always realize is that whatever it is that you know, you can share that expertise, that knowledge is going to get somebody further along than you were at that time potentially. And so you want to continue to kind of pour into your audience, pour into the people that you can create value for. And you do that a lot of times by sharing. So not only are you going to share your story, you're going to be sharing your expertise, your knowledge, your great things that you've done, and the not so great things that you've done as well too. And that's going to give you that opportunity. But one of the really cool things around creating that evergreen content that I kind of talked about is that that content can be a pillar piece of your overall marketing strategy. So what I mean by that is that if during this piece of content you talk a lot around, like I'll go back to the content-based networking that James Carberry talked about. When you aren't sure exactly how to do that, James can actually sit down and talk with everybody one on one forever. And he wouldn't have enough time and enough hours to be able to have those conversations. Well, what you allow yourself to do when you create this evergreen piece of content is that it becomes something that's shareable. It can become a pillar piece of content. If you're having a conversation, someone has a question that you've already answered during the podcast, why not share that piece of video and say, hey, if you want to expand upon that or you want to brainstorm a little bit, listen to this 2 or 3 minute clip. And here's my scheduling link. If you want to talk more, let's chat more about what that looks like. And it allows you to maximize your time. Again, going back to that resource part, we have a limited amount of time. So you want to make sure you leverage that as much as possible. So what better way than to have yourself built up in front of an audience of people and have that repurposed piece of content where someone's not necessarily asking you why you're great, but pulling out of you those things that are great so that you can, at the end of the day, be able to show that authority. And, like I really touched on, driving traffic leads without necessarily having to do that in a paid way. Now don't get me wrong, there's definitely paid podcasts that are out there, and those paid podcasts, usually you just want to drive into why is it paid. And it doesn't necessarily mean that it shouldn't be paid, because I think that there's a different way to run, a business, and people get to decide exactly how they're going to run their business and their podcast. So I'm not necessarily, someone that's against that, but I think what you really want to do is make sure that you are, providing a tremendous amount of value and opportunity for people to be able to understand what value they're getting by paying for that. So generally speaking, a lot more podcasts are going to be those podcasts that you don't have to pay. Our podcast, the IAMCEO podcast, we have an application process, but we don't have a paid process. So you're going to be able to definitely, leverage that as much as possible. So I think that that's one of the really cool things. And I think that as you kind of go through the process, you'll see some really cool things that happen as a host. I think one of the things that touched me more than anything else is Dr. Jacqueline from No More Nausea. I had her on very early on when I started my podcast, and what I did, and one of the reasons I created the podcast was because I wanted to, do networking and connecting. I also wanted to grow my digital marketing business, but I also wanted an opportunity to get to connect with people that we had featured on our blog. So we do a lot of roundup posts where we basically ask people, why did they start their business? We ask people what advice would they have for somebody that wants to start their business, just all these questions. And I remember it caught me off guard. It had to be within the first like 15 or 20 episodes that I did. And mind you, like the second episode, I was fumbling over my words, so I couldn't even get the person's name out. It was just like, chaos. So if you go back and listen to those first episodes, I've come a long way, hopefully. But even on this live, I'm probably fumbling over a lot of stuff already. But with that being said, what really kind of touched me is because when I had Dr. Jackie on the show, she mentioned that because of a call we had put out using Haro, we had asked people like, why did you start your business? Or what do you think being a CEO means to you? And she answered that question, and she said because she answered that question, it pushed her into starting her business, which ended up being in Walmart and all these, great locations and great notoriety and opportunity. But had I not had the podcast, I would never have known about that. So I think so many times we as people that, continue to kind of put stuff out, and especially if you're a creator and you start to create stuff, you don't always know if you're making an impact. So I always go back to that story because I think so many times as guests or hosts or people that have developed their craft or whatever, you might be that, and you're listening to this, we have to understand that we have a gift, and that gift is to be given. The gift is not to be hoarded. The gift is not to be, locked away or not shared. It's really to be able to impact other people. And often when we do those things, we may not see every single person it impacts, but it's so important that we make sure that we do this. Even me doing this live and doing that is something that I haven't done before. But because I've guested on a few podcasts, over probably around 50 or so, but also hosted so many people, I felt like it was a really great opportunity to kind of share some of the great things that are going on. And Mercy on our team, it was the one that kind of pushed us to do it, pushed me to do it, to say, hey, this is something that we could do to kind of make sure that, we provide value to people, but also, let people know a little bit more about our podcast. So I think that's one of the really big things that, I wanted to kind of hammer home, more than anything else, is that you never know what that impact could be. But I can also say that because I've co-created with people, I've had one of my longest tiered, SEO clients, because I've had, a person, Liz Teresa, who also has a podcast, a phenomenal podcast, and does phenomenal things. We're kind of synergistically in the same space, but we were able to kind of co-create and collaborate. And as a result of that, I've had a long tier client. So those things happen when you are kind of looking from an abundant mentality, not necessarily a, closed mentality or a mentality of lack. So you really want to look at this as an opportunity to kind of co-create. And sometimes you know exactly what's going to happen. Sometimes you don't know what's going to happen. Like, I had with Dr. Jackie. So you just want to be ultimately open to what that could be. And I think even me, like being a guest on shows, it's been really great to really get to see how people do their shows, how they interact. Just all those things here, see how people set up their models. Because I think one of the things that people, misconception around podcasting is that there's one way to podcast. You have to do the Joe Rogan route. If you're not getting ads, if you're not having people, then people purchase spots on your podcast and you're doing it wrong. And that's completely wrong, I believe. So I think that one of the best ways that you can leverage a podcast, and if you have a podcast, or even if you're guesting on podcast, is really to share your expertise and knowledge. If you have a business, if you have an expertise, you have a knowledge, I think it's one of the best ways to share that. Frankly, it also gives you the reps, so to speak, so that you can get to kind of talk around the things that you're doing and how you're doing it. So I think that's been, definitely my, really big, thing related to podcasting. So what you really want to look for, on how to ultimately be a great podcast guest. Every podcast is different. I can only speak, from my podcast, but I think one of the things that you always want to make sure that you ask is that question that I kind of touched on. You may not want to ask it in that way. Is every podcast hosts, you want to ask essentially what's in it for them. WIIFM, what's in it for me? That's what station they're tuned into. That's what station they're leveraged from. There might be a reason that they're doing this podcast. Maybe they're doing the podcast to kind of co-create content. Maybe they're doing the podcast to network. Maybe they're doing the podcast to go the Joe Rogan route. Maybe they're doing the podcast to provide value for their ideal clients and customers. Maybe they want to be referral partners with people. So whatever it is, you want to try to get as much clarity on that, and then understand not just their overall aim and their mission for the podcast, but also understand what the overall goal for that piece of content is going to be. Sometimes hosts will be able to tell you, like, this is exactly like what we're looking for, and these are the questions that I have. I myself, and we have a little bit more of a organic but a more structured type of questioning that we ask. Those questions are very broad, but at the same time, we can drill into very specific things. But I think one of the really cool things that you really want to do and how to be a great guest is understand ultimately, like, what's the aim of the podcast host? What's the aim of the podcast? What would really make this episode one of the best episodes? I think I get that question not nearly enough, but I think it's one of the most valuable questions. I even have had people on the show, especially when I do intro calls, and our intro calls are optional. But especially in the very beginning, I required intro calls because I wanted to also know what are the questions that people ask on a regular basis. How can I answer those questions before they even, ask them? And especially if we have like PR firms or media firms that actually connect us with guests, I want to make sure I provide as much information as possible so that we could definitely do an intro call, because I like doing intro calls. I think it's actually a great way to kind of connect and at the very least hear a person's name, hear a person's voice, and see a person. A lot of times it's really great. I think most of the episodes, I would say if somebody offers the opportunity to do an intro call, yes, it's an extra 10 or 15 minutes, but make sure you do that, because I think it's going to make sure that it's a good match. And I think even for me, like I've had and done intro calls where it hasn't necessarily been the right fit, or maybe that person has said, I don't think this is the right fit for me because of X, Y, and ABC, but you get to have that opportunity to do that. So make sure that you do that. um but know exactly like how you can provide value and what that looks like, from your perspective. And don't think, and definitely don't go on a podcast and just sell, just say, hey, I'm selling this widget, I have this thing, I have this other thing. Try to really provide some value, because what you really want to know, and I think one of the best ways to leverage guesting on podcasts is to show your authority and show your expertise. Think about it. You have, depending on how long the podcast is, I would just say an hour. Usually ours are 30 to 40 minutes, to get to shine a light on not everything that you're doing since you were born, but as much information as you can to provide value. So you want to make sure that you're doing that, because you're taking that piece of content and you want to kind of reshare that. What you don't want to do, and when you think about like resharing, you don't want to say that, hey, I'm going to be, resharing the same thing over and over again. So it's something that you really want to kind of lean in on, and understand that you want to try to be of value, to the person, and it just ultimately kind of move from there. The other big thing that I see as common mistakes is, I always say, like, I think a really great podcast guest is like a good game at tennis. We're doing back and forth. I'm hitting it to them because I want them, to talk about what they do, and then I want them to hit it back. But I've also had podcasts where I literally have just hit the ball over and the person just took it and took off and just went running. And those aren't the best podcasts, because we have to do a lot of post editing, and it's always not great, because we want to try to make sure that we are um creating space so that there is a back and forth. Because if you basically are just taking the ball and just running with it, it's essentially like what I'm doing now. It's alive, it's a soliloquy. And that's not, I think, what makes podcasting really popular and really great. So I definitely want to, hammer home that you make sure you do that. But make sure you do have a strong pitch. Make sure you ask the host as well too, if it's okay to pitch. On our podcast, at the very end is usually the best place to pitch. Sometimes people, mention it here and there, and I understand the aspect, but we really want to try to make sure that we have a call to action, a strong call to action, if at all possible, at the very beginning. Tell stories. Stories take the cake, as I always say. So if there's an opportunity for you to talk around something, make sure you do that. One of the things that I always go back to, usually when I'm guest on the podcast, is I started a family newspaper when I was 10. I said that plant seeds to a lot of the things that I do now. I always, I joke, but I'm actually very serious. I always ask myself, what would 10-year-old Gresh do? What would that family newspaper mogul do, and what would that look like? And that's when I go back to like filter through like how I should approach things. And a lot of times when I find that I'm not doing things that are in alignment, it's because I'm not doing what 10-year-old Gresh would do. And I think that's one of the really big things that, I usually start out with that story. That story gives a lot of context into like who I am. And I think it's unique enough that a lot of people haven't necessarily done that. Don't sell. Uh, Gary Vaynerchuk has the jab, 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 right hook that he wrote years and years ago. It's the idea is that you give, and then you ask, and that giving can go on over and over and over and over again. You just want to make sure that you're giving value. I think you want to make sure that you have space, and frankly, if you do want to go there to be able to grow your business, maybe you ask, is there a really great place or time that I could mention this, before you go live or before you go on the show or whatever that might be. Just make sure you get a full lay of the land, so you know exactly like how those things would work. Um, So there's lots of different resources out there, to really find that you can, go live. There's not necessarily a set way. Usually every podcast has its own way that you can, provide value. That you can pitch yourself, or the process that they go through. I'll show you a little bit more on like how we, kind of take in people in our podcast, but know that it's absolutely different. Make sure that you customize the podcast pitch. I think, you see the pitches that say hi name, and it literally has the brackets with the name and those things. And you want to make sure that you're making it as custom as possible. We have an intake process largely so that we're just not getting anybody that comes in. We want to make sure that somebody actually wants to be on the show. It's just not saying, "Hey, let me just jump on this podcast." You actually, have shown like you do want to actually be on our podcast, and I'm sure most. Hosts, especially after they've started to have on podcasts, want to make sure that they give people a value, because one of the no-nos that we have is, like, it sounds crazy, but just showing up on time, for the podcast, and actually, doing that, which is crazy, but it happens where sometimes people just don't show up. Of course things happen, and being able to kind of communicate is such a huge thing. But I think one of the reasons that we have a I won't say it's a very lengthy process, but I feel like we have some of those things is so that we can make sure that somebody is actually wanting to be on the show, and that ends up being like a really great thing. So make sure, when you pitch yourself, you make sure you show your expertise, your knowledge, the things that you've done, things that are really valuable to podcast hosts, or like how are you going to promote the episode. I think the host wants to do some of that, but the guests as well should also be doing a lot of the promoting. So if there's different things that you need, asking, do you provide, these things, you could of course do that. But you want to make sure that you're creating, an opportunity and space for people to do that as much as possible, so that you can, show, as much value. You want to ask those questions. You want to make sure that you are ready to work as much as the host is supposed to work. I think a lot of times people go on I think it's a huge misconception where people go on podcasts and they think that they don't have to do anything else after that. But I think some of the best downloaded and highest downloaded podcasts we've had is because the people have also done, their part as well too. So with that being said, I just wanted to show we have a fairly, easy process that, we go to try to get people that are, on the show. So that said, let me just share a little bit more on like how you can apply to the IMCO podcast, or really any other ways that we try to connect. So with that said, you're just going to go over to IAMCEO.co, and you're just going to do apply. You're really just going to fill out the form there. We just have a nomination form. You can nominate yourself. Self nominations are definitely appreciated. So, know that you can just go and do that, and you just literally just fill out the form. One of the things that I see is funny, because when you ask a person, why should I be considered, you see people say that because I talked with Gresh or something like that. And while that, we might have had that conversation, I think what ends up happening is that the person that sometimes, and for our case, the person that is asking you to apply is not always the person that's reviewing the application. So you want to make sure that you're showing that value. And again, it's another step, but just know it's something that you can do there. We have some more information, but that's literally, we can't try to keep it quick and easy on how you can apply for the show. After that, we have a process where we reach out to people that we want to have that are guests on the show. But ultimately, that's it. I mean, again, just to kind of, close everything out, I think podcasting is such a phenomenal opportunity for you to be able to share who you are and what you do and how you do it. Your story takes the cake, and to be able to share that and have somebody build that up ends up being, some of the best ways. One other thing I will say, let's see if I could find the URL. Help for podcasts. These are definitely, CEO hacks that I have, and these are things that if you go to help the number 4 podcasts with an s.com. You can see a lot of resources. These are for people that want to basically launch podcasts, but also if you're thinking like, hey, I just want to be a guest, like what being a guest looks like. If you want to get podcast equipment, like what microphone should I get, you could do that as well too. So you could kind of go through and see like, this is a way that you could generate leads, using podcasts. Is one of the CEO hacks that we have. This is more about the media company, building and being a media company. Or if you say, hey, I've been on a lot of podcasts. Hey, I just want to start my own, then do that. And one other quick tip before I head out. If you think that you want to start a podcast, it is not easy. It's pretty much like starting your own business. Honestly, it's another business. It takes that much time. You have to market. You have to do all those things. You have to get guests, just like you're getting clients. Sometimes it's even harder to get guests as it is to get clients. But know that you can definitely jump on people's podcasts and leverage that as a way to figure out if you do want to start your own podcast. I think it's one of the best ways that you can do that. And I think it's, again, something that's underutilized. And I think even as you start to build those relationships and you decide that, hey, I do want to start a podcast, you can always circle back with people. So that's one of the things that I just want to kind of leave you with. You can also see the CEO hacks for your podcast as well, too. So there's lots of things that you can use if you do want to look into podcasts and what equipment to get, things like that. Podcast guests, if you want to go on podcastguests.com. There's lots of hacks and nuggets and things and probably more that I'll end up sharing. There's a Facebook group, the Podcast Guesting Collaboration Community, which is a Facebook group as well too, where podcasters are looking for guests. So there's lots of resources. So I went way over. I started late, ended late as well too, but hopefully this is of value. Definitely let me know if I could be of any help. But I would love to see your application. If you think that you might be a good guest for a podcast, but if you know somebody else that will be a good guest for our podcast, we're always appreciative of any type of nomination.